In the summer of 2020, the government of Spain's Balearic Islands did something no government in Europe had done before. It passed a law naming 3 holiday strips where the selling and advertising of alcohol would now be restricted by decree. 2 were on the island of Mallorca. The third was a single square mile on the west coast of Ibiza, a town called San Antonio. 40 years earlier, that same square mile had sold the world the exact opposite promise. A place, as one famous song once put it, where the drinks are free. That song was Club Tropicana. Wham filmed the video for it in the spring of 1983 at a small hotel in the hills just above the town. George Michael was 19 and Andrew Ridgeley 20, and they spent the shoot draped around a swimming pool that stood in for a life with no bills and no limits. When the record climbed to number 4 in Britain that summer, the pool became one of the pictures a whole country kept of the island. Sun, water and money that never seemed to run out. More than 3.25 million people still came to Ibiza in the year 2024. San Antonio's own population has never been higher than it is today, close to 29,000 people. Nobody stopped coming. What went missing was the thing the island had first been loved for, and to find it, you have to go back to a time when almost nobody came here at all. San Antonio sits on a wide, west-facing bay near the top of Ibiza, sheltered water that has been used by boats for as long as there have been boats in these seas. Its proper name is Sant Antoni de Portmany, and the second half of that name comes from the Latin for the larger of the island's 2 great natural harbours. For most of its history, it was a small fishing and farming town. Whitewashed houses gathered around a 14th century church, boats pulled up on the sand, a living made from salt and almonds and figs, a place the rest of Europe had no particular reason to think about. That began to change in 1958, when Ibiza opened an airport. Spain in those years was poor and cut off from most of its neighbours, still recovering from a civil war that had ended less than 20 years before, and the government in Madrid had started to see cheap sunshine as one of the few things it could sell to the richer countries of the north. San Antonio, with its calm bay and its long, warm afternoons, was the first town on the island to take up the trade in earnest. The first hotels went up along the seafront, then more of them, then more. Historians of Ibizan tourism call San Antonio the island's pioneer resort, the place from which the whole industry then spread outward across the island. One academic study of that period puts the growth bluntly. It was disorderly and it was very fast. But before the package tour arrived, there was a stranger and much quieter arrival, and it is the one that gave the island the reputation it would later spend everything trying to live up to. Through the 1960s, Ibiza became one of the handful of places in Europe where a person could go to disappear. It was warm, it was astonishingly cheap, and it was far enough from anywhere important to feel outside the ordinary rules. Painters came, and writers and drifters, and a fair number of people who had good reasons to be somewhere nobody was looking for them. There were open-air markets where long-haired travellers sold beads and leather, and there were beaches where the only sound after dark was the sea. They did not come for nightlife, because there was almost none. They came for the opposite of everything the island would one day be famous for the emptiness, for the cheap wine, for a coastline you could still have almost entirely to yourself. One of the people the island quietly sheltered was Elmir Dahori, a Hungarian painter who settled on Ibiza in the early 1960s and who turned out to be one of the most accomplished art forgers of the 20th century. From a villa on the island, he sold imitation Picassos, Matisses and Modiglianis to galleries and private collectors around the world so convincingly that art historians are still not certain how many of his fakes hang in respectable collections to this day. Another was Clifford Irving, an American writer living on the same island, who in the early 1970s produced a completely fraudulent authorized biography of the reclusive billionaire Howard Hughes, and who briefly persuaded one of the largest publishers in New York to pay a fortune for it before the whole scheme collapsed in scandal. Ibiza in those years was full of people for whom the truth was a flexible thing and the light was always good. In 1969, the film director Barbet Schroeder shot a picture called More Across Ibiza and its smaller neighbour Formentera, a bleak story of young lovers and heroin, and he asked a then little-known British band called Pink Floyd to write the soundtrack. The film did only modest business, But it planted the island in the imagination of a certain kind of restless young European, and by one account, it was that very film that persuaded a young Spaniard named José Padilla to move to Ibiza and build his whole life there. The clearest emblem of that first Ibiza was a musician who was not born there and did not die famous. Her name was Nico, and 2 decades earlier, she had been one of the most recognizable faces of the New York avant-garde, the cool German voice on the first Velvet Underground record. By the late 1980s, that life was long behind her, and she was living quietly and spending her summers on the island. On the 18th of July, 1988, on what was reported to be the hottest day of the year, she went out on a bicycle and collapsed. She had suffered a cerebral hemorrhage and she died in hospital at the age of 49. Her ashes were carried back to Berlin and buried there. She died in the same summer that something entirely new was catching fire a few miles down the coast, and the two events are almost never told together. The old Ibiza, the island of forgers and painters and people hiding from their own century, was quietly ending. The loud one was already several years old. It had begun, in fact, back in 1980, in a low white building on a small rocky inlet just west of San Antonio's harbour, at a spot called Calo de Moro. 3 men opened a bar there that year and did one very clever thing with it. They pointed all of its chairs in a single direction, out to the west, straight at the sunset. The bar was called Café Del Mar, and its whole idea was almost embarrassingly simple. Ibiza's west coast faces directly into some of the most spectacular sunsets anywhere in the Mediterranean, and San Antonio sits right on that coast. The bar sold a customer a drink, a seat, and the sky at the end of the day. For its first decade, it was simply a very well-placed bar. Then in 1991, it took on a resident disc jockey, the same José Padilla who the film was said to have first brought to the island. Padilla began to build slow, wordless, atmospheric records to play as the light went down, music timed to the pace of a sunset rather than a dance floor. In 1994, the bar released the first of them as an album and called it simply Volumen Uno. It sold around the world, then sold again as a whole series of follow-ups. It effectively invented an entire genre of recorded music, the soft ambient sound that came to be labelled chill out, and it turned the ordinary act of watching the San Antonio sun go down into something people flew across a continent to do. Padilla stayed bound up with the place for years, and when he died of cancer in 2020, the island mourned him as the man who had written the score for its evenings. The sunset was the gentle half of what San Antonio was becoming. The other half was a great deal louder, and its landmark was older than the bar. In August of 1975, in the dense streets set back behind the seafront, a nightclub called Es Paradis had opened its doors, said to be the second oldest on the whole island after Pacha over in Ibiza town. It was designed by an artist named Luis Güell, the same man who would later shape the look of Café Del Mar, and it was built to resemble not a nightclub at all, but a white temple full of marble, plants, and running fountains. In 1990, when new noise rules forced the island's clubs to enclose themselves, Es Paradis roofed its central room with an enormous glass pyramid weighing 120 tons, and it became famous right across Europe for one particular spectacle. On certain nights, the staff would flood the sunken dance floor with water and let the crowd dance knee-deep in it, a ritual they called the Fiesta del Agua, the party of the water. By the middle of that decade, Es Paradis had a fierce rival a few streets away, a superclub called Eden, and between them, the two of them anchored San Antonio's nightlife, the way the little bar anchored its evenings. But the thing that turned Ibiza from a well-liked holiday island into a global phenomenon did not actually happen in San Antonio at all. It happened a few miles inland, and it happened almost by accident. In 1987, 4 young men from London came to the island on holiday together. Their names were Paul Oakenfold, Danny Rampling, Nicky Holloway and Johnny Walker, and back home they were working disc jockeys playing to modest crowds. On the island they made their way to a club called Amnesia, which sits not in San Antonio but out in the open countryside near the village of San Rafael. Its resident that summer was an Argentine named Alfredo Fiorito, and Fiorito played in a way that none of the four had ever heard. He mixed whatever fit the mood of the room, pop against soul against strange European electronics, hour after hour, all the way through the open-air night until the sun came up over the dance floor. The style became known as the Balearic Beat, named after these islands themselves. The four of them carried it home, and what they did with it reshaped British culture for the next 30 years. That same autumn, Rampling opened a tiny, dripping, low-ceilinged club in a South London fitness centre and called it Shoom. The following spring, on the 11th of April 1988, Oakenfold opened a night called Spectrum at the Club Heaven, under the railway arches at Charing Cross. What these men were importing was not simply a crate of records, it was the whole feeling of an Ibiza night, and in a grey, recession-bound Britain, it went off like a charge. That year became known ever afterwards as the second summer of love, the birth of acid house and of rave culture, a movement that within a few years was filling fields and aircraft hangars with tens of thousands of young people at a time. And it can be traced, almost individual by individual, back to a single open-air dance floor on this one small island. Ibiza had become, in the phrase the marketing would soon settle on, the clubbing capital of the world, and its two faces were booming at the very same time. The calm sunset bar out in the west and the all-night dance floor in the streets were two halves of one enormously profitable machine. Through the season, the island filled with young Britons by the plane load, and the money that arrived with them was extraordinary. Nowhere showed the glamour of that peak more plainly than the hotel in the hills where Wham had made their video. It was called Pike's. It was run by a charismatic Australian named Tony Pike, and it became the discreet place where the famous went to misbehave far from the cameras. In September of 1987, the singer Freddie Mercury held his 41st birthday party there. By the account of the hotel's owner, the party ran through around 350 bottles of champagne and filled the grounds with hundreds of enormous balloons, and it has been remembered ever since as one of the most extravagant parties ever thrown on the island. By later accounts, Mercury had been told, only months before that night, that he was seriously ill. He would die of that illness 4 years later, in 1991. For a while, the two Ibizas held together, the sacred and the profane sharing one small island. And in 1999, right in the middle of the loudest decade the place had ever known, an unexpected thing happened. The cultural body of the United Nations added Ibiza to its list of World Heritage Sites, and not for a single nightclub. The listing was titled Ibiza, Biodiversity and Culture, and it protected 4 separate treasures. The Renaissance walls of the old town, still among the best preserved of their kind anywhere in Europe. A Phoenician trading settlement, more than 2,500 years old, at a place called Sacaletta. A vast ancient burial ground, honeycombed with thousands of tombs. And the great underwater meadows of a slow-growing seagrass called Posidonia, out in the clear water off the coast, some of it believed to be tens of thousands of years old, and among the oldest living organisms anywhere on the planet. So at the very moment the world had decided Ibiza was a place to lose a weekend, and your inhibitions, an international body, was quietly certifying it as one of the most historically and ecologically precious islands in the whole Mediterranean. And the crowds were the problem, because the crowds the island had drawn and the crowds it now actually wanted were no longer the same people. The disc jockeys had exported a sound and a feeling. What came flooding back, year after year through the 1990s, was mass tourism on an industrial scale. Cheap charter flights and cheaper package deals aimed squarely at the British 18 to 30 market, and a very large share of it landed in one town, San Antonio, and within that town it concentrated in one small place. A short, dense grid of streets set back from the harbour, packed with bars stacked wall to wall, each with its own doorway tout, waving a laminated drinks menu, and its own sound system turned up to fight its neighbours. The area had an English name that everybody used, tourists and locals alike, the West End. By day it was ordinary enough, a little tired in the flat sunlight, but through the height of the season, from dark until well past dawn, it turned into one of the most intensely concentrated drinking strips anywhere in Europe, and its reputation began to travel back to Britain ahead of the tourists themselves. The thing that fixed that reputation in the national mind was not a newspaper story or a police report. It was a television programme. On the 6th of July 1997, the British satellite channel Sky One broadcast the first episode of a documentary series called Ibiza Uncovered. It was filmed almost entirely inside that 1 square mile of San Antonio, following young British holidaymakers through the bars, the beaches, the foam parties, and the sunburnt mornings after. It was an enormous hit, and it more or less created a whole genre of British television, the sun and sin holiday show that would fill late-night schedules for the next decade. But it did something far more lasting than entertain. For a great many British people who would never actually set foot there, that series simply became Ibiza, an endless loop of burnt skin, foam, lager and regret. The Strip never once had to advertise itself as the wickedest resort in the Mediterranean. A film crew and a broadcaster did the naming for it, and the name stuck fast. Underneath the television version, though, a real and very specific danger had begun to grow, and it was serious enough that the Spanish coined a word for it: balconing. The word describes what happens when young holidaymakers, very often drunk, climb along the outside of hotel balconies, try to leap from one balcony across to the next, or attempt to drop from a balcony into a swimming pool and miss. By one estimate later reported in the Spanish press, falls of this kind were killing somewhere between 6 and 12 people a year across the country, though the government kept no official tally. By the summer of 2013, it had become common enough that the British government issued a formal public warning. Its Consul General for the region, a man named Andrew Gwatkin, stated that in the previous year, 2012, 4 British citizens had died in balcony falls in Spain, out of a total of 18 such falls, and he named Magaluf and San Antonio as the 2 worst places on earth for it. These were not stunts that went slightly wrong. They were young people dying on holiday, one summer after another, in the same small handful of resorts. The sheer scale of what the British consulates on the islands were quietly dealing with became public a couple of years later, when the Foreign Office ran a summer safety campaign and released some of its own figures. Across a single season, from May to September, its staff covering Ibiza and neighbouring Mallorca had handled 38 British citizens taken to hospital, 170 people detained by the police, 13 reported cases of rape or sexual assault, and 546 lost or stolen passports. Every single one of those cases involved a British holidaymaker between 15 and 30 years old. And that was the ordinary background workload of a normal summer, not a count of its true disasters. Running underneath all of it was the trade that a party economy on this scale always attracts. In August of 2010, a joint operation between British and Spanish police, working across San Antonio and 2 of its neighbouring towns, arrested 25 people, 20 of them British nationals. They seized 4 kilograms of cocaine, 38,000 ecstasy tablets, a quantity of ketamine and of the liquid drug known as GHB, and the equivalent of nearly £46,000 in cash. The people running the drugs on the Strip, in other words, were very often exactly the same nationality as the young people buying them. A later operation in San Antonio itself, reported in the local island press, broke up another network, arrested 21 people, and seized cocaine, ketamine, ecstasy, and thousands of prepared doses of other drugs, along with 300 stolen mobile phones. And in September of 2024, police across the wider Balearic region announced what they called the largest seizure of its kind in the whole of Spanish history. More than 700 kilograms of drugs in all, among them over 1 million ecstasy pills, more than 200 kilograms of ketamine, and a quantity of a substance the Strip had taken to calling pink cocaine. The entire haul valued at more than 25 million euros. 9 people were arrested over it, most of them not British at all, but Italian, Dutch and Spanish. A haul on that scale meant organised supply chains stood behind it, feeding a market that came back larger every June. By the end of the 2010s, the authorities had decided they had finally had enough, and they reached for a tool no European government had used before. In January of 2020, the Balearic government passed the decree this story opened on, and it was blunt. in 3 named zones, with San Antonio's West End sitting on the list beside 2 strips over on Mallorca. It banned happy hours, 2-for-1 drinks, open bar offers, organised pub crawls, and the party boats that ran drinkers up and down the coast. It ordered the shops in those zones to stop selling alcohol altogether between 9:30 at night and 8 the following morning. It banned balconing outright across every one of the islands, with fines that could climb as high as €60,000. And it described itself quite accurately as the first law of its kind adopted anywhere in Europe. 4 years later, in the spring of 2024, the government renewed it and hardened it further, extending the rules out to the end of 2027 and adding a fresh ban on drinking in the open street across San Antonio and the worst hit towns of Mallorca. The town that had once sold the world a song about free drinks was now the test case for the whole continent's first law written against cheap ones. And still, for all the new rules, the oldest danger did not go away. In July of 2025, 2 young British men fell to their deaths from the same San Antonio hotel within 2 weeks of one another. The first was Evan Thompson, 26 years old, from Aberdeen, who died on the 7th of July. The second was Gary Kelly, 19, an ice hockey player from Dundee, who fell from the 3rd floor on the 21st of July, a death the Spanish Civil Guard said appeared to have been an accident. The hotel, which had spent that very summer celebrating its 20th anniversary, quietly paused its programme of events. 2 families flew home from a holiday island carrying coffins in the space of a single fortnight, more than 35 years after those 4 young disc jockeys first came here for the summer of their lives. Walk the West End today, and it is a noticeably quieter place than the television once left it. People who have watched the strip closely for years report that it has physically shrunk, that bars have closed and not reopened, and that the traditional young British drinking crowd no longer thinks of San Antonio first. The town now promotes something it calls quality tourism, steering its visitors towards its 14th century church, its prehistoric ruins and its old stone watchtowers along the coast rather than its bars. The very law the town once resisted has become part of how it now sells itself to a gentler kind of visitor. And the sunset, at least, is still there. Café Del Mar still sits on its little bay with all of its chairs turned to the west, 45 years after those 3 men first opened it, and people still gather every single evening to watch the sky change colour over the water. But the sunset is no longer free. By the summer of 2025, according to people who had been recently, taking a seat in the front row to watch it carried a minimum spend of €90 a head, with €60 charged for the row just behind. The one thing the island had once simply given away, the light on the water at the close of the day, now comes with a price list and a rope. More than 3.25 million visitors came to Ibiza in 2024, only 3 in every 100 fewer than the island's all-time record the summer before. A resident population at its highest point in history, a drinking strip so relentless that a government had to write a law to slow it down. By every measure a tourist board knows how to count, San Antonio never declined at all. What it lost cannot be counted in the same way. It lost the emptiness that the painters and the forgers and the drifters had come all that way to find. The cheap wine and the coastline a person could once have almost to themselves. And it lost the version of itself that a 19-year-old George Michael was flown out to sell, a place with no bills and no limits. Right at the moment it began charging €90 for a decent view of the sky. The island is still here, and it is busier than it has ever been in its whole long life. The quiet is the thing that left. If this is the kind of story you find yourself still turning over after it ends, there is another one already waiting on the screen in front of you now. YouTube seems reasonably confident you are going to want to watch it. For once it might just be right.